Along with selecting an application server, you also need to choose a database before building your web application using Dreamweaver CS4. Here are some of the questions you'll need to ask. First, what operating system are you using to host the database? In many cases, the hardware that's used to host the application server and the database are the same. In other cases, you can have a separate machine for the application server from the database. You'll need to know whether your database server will be based on Windows, Linux, or some other operating system. You'll also need to know whether you can pay license fees. Some of the very powerful database servers, such as SQL Server, Oracle, or DB2, can involve significant license fees for web deployment. Many of these databases, including SQL Server, have free versions, so you'll need to know what your parameters are before you make the selection. You'll also need to know generally how busy your web application will be. By busy, I'm talking about the issue of scalability. How many simultaneous users will be hitting the database to retrieve or modify data? Here are some of the common databases used in the web: MySQL, SQL Server, Oracle, DB2, Access, and Apache Derby. On the next slides, I'll describe some of the most common choices and their pros and cons. Microsoft Access is available for use on Windows-based application server environments. It's not a database server. Instead, Access database files are addressed directly through the application server. You use Microsoft Access on your development system to create the database structure, and then optionally, you can seed your database with initial data. You then upload the .mdb file, that's the database file, to your application server for production use. Of the three application servers I'll be describing in this video series, Active Server Pages, or Classic ASP, and Cold Fusion both work very well with Access. The pros of Access include its ease of use. It's easy to set up, and it has a very simple visual administration interface. Also, there are no license fees for web deployment. You simply copy the MDB file up to your server, and you start building your web application. Access's cons include its scalability and ease of use on the web. It's not easy to manage in a web application. That is, once you've uploaded the MDB file to your web server, there's no automatic visual interface available to change the structure of the data. Also, it's not a database server, and so the database file itself has to be downloaded from the server back to your development system if you want to make any changes to the database structure. And finally, it's not scalable. It's not designed for busy multi-user applications. If you're working on a Windows environment and you want a very powerful database server, you can try SQL Server, also from Microsoft. SQL Server is one of a class of servers known as enterprise systems. It's suitable for use in very large-scale organizations and can handle massive amounts of data, depending on what edition of the server you use. As with Access, SQL Server works very easily with Active Server Pages and Cold Fusion. Its pros include that there is a free version, SQL Server 2005 or 2008 Express, that works very well with small and medium-scale websites. You can also use SQL Server through hosted services provided by ISPs. And there's a very easy and intuitive visual administration tool provided by Microsoft for free. The cons of SQL Server have to do with resource requirements and license fees. The server can be very resource intensive depending on how much data is being managed, and in an ideal deployment, it should be hosted on its own separate computer hardware, separate from the application server. This can, of course, increase the costs of deployment. And if you can't use the Express edition of SQL Server, there are significant license fees involved if you want to deploy the more powerful editions of SQL Server on your website. This brings us to MySQL, my database of choice. MySQL is free for most organizational uses. It's easy and intuitive, and unlike SQL Server, it's portable across operating systems. MySQL provides a community edition that's free to download and use. If you want to bundle a MySQL database server with your own commercial software, there is a license fee required for that. But if you only need to use MySQL to host your web-based application, it's completely free. MySQL works very well with PHP and Cold Fusion. It can be made to work with Active Server Pages, but there are drivers and additional code you would need to implement that Dreamweaver doesn't know how to generate. The pros of MySQL include its scalability. It's a very highly scalable database that can handle massive amounts of data. There are many easy visual administration tools available both from MySQL and from third parties, and the memory usage in MySQL can be scaled so that you can set up to use all available server memory in an isolated, dedicated environment, or you can scale down resource usage when you want to use it on the same hardware as your application server. There aren't many cons to MySQL that I'm aware of. In fact, for my money, it's the easiest, most portable database server available, and I'll be using it in both the ColdFusion and the PHP sections of this video series. There are other databases available. For example, in the Enterprise Database class, you could select Oracle or IBM DB2. Depending on the version of ColdFusion you have, you might be able to hook up very easily to these databases. And Dreamweaver would be able to generate dynamic web applications for ColdFusion server applications that use these databases. If you want to use these other enterprise databases with ASP or PHP, though, you'll need to download additional libraries, and you probably won't be able to generate code for those applications out of Dreamweaver. And then for the ColdFusion crowd, there's also a Java-based embedded database engine called Apache Derby. ColdFusion 8 includes the drivers for this database, and all of the sample applications included with ColdFusion are now built in this database format. Derby supports multiple operating systems, so a database can move from Windows, say, to Mac without having to be rewritten, and Apache Derby gives you great performance. Just like the enterprise databases, there's no direct support for Apache Derby in ASP or PHP, but if you're working with ColdFusion as your application server, it can also make for a very good choice. In this video series, I'll be using Microsoft Access for the sections on active server pages and MySQL for the sections on ColdFusion and PHP.